Hello everybody, and welcome to the Theros Beyond Death Limited Guide. This video is jam-packed with all the information you're going to need to crush it at your pre-release and win your first drafts of Theros Beyond Death. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, you can help me out by remembering to click that thumbs up button, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment in the comment section down below if you have any questions at all or feedback. But without further ado, let's get to the guide. In this guide, we are going to be discussing the top 3 commons by color, the color rankings, the archetypes in Theros Beyond Death, combat tricks to be aware of at the common and uncommon level, and finally some traps and combos to be aware of when you are drafting and playing sealed of this set. So first up, we're going to be starting with the white commons. The best white common is Dreadful Apathy. This is just a very efficient removal spell, and it is also an aura, which is quite relevant for several of the archetypes in the set. This is going to be a pretty high pick. Next is Daybreak Chimera, just a pretty efficient flying body in a deck that's probably going to want to be aggressive. It's just pretty undercosted for what it does a lot of the time. And finally, Hero of the Pride is going to be a staple of the tokens deck in the set. There's a lot of things that target, and Hero of the Pride is going to be a premium 2-drop. Moving on to the blue commons, the top blue common is Naiad of Hidden Coves. This card is very important for decks trying to operate at instant speed, notably the blue-red deck, but there are also other control decks that are going to get a pretty good benefit from using Naiad of Hidden Coves. It's also an enchantment creature for the decks that care about that. The next top blue common is Stern Dismissal. This card cannot target your own creatures, so keep that in mind. It is a little bit unlike other common bounce spells that we've seen in the past, where you can normally bounce your own creature to save them from removal, but in a set that is all about auras and all about enchanting your creatures, Stern Dismissal can really blow your opponent out. For optimal benefit, cast this in response to their aura on their creature, and then the aura just fizzles and goes to the graveyard. The third best blue common is Ichthyomorphosis. I am very proud of the way I pronounced that on my first try. It's just a pretty solid blue removal spell. Making a creature into a 0/1 essentially kills it, and the fact that it is an aura and also triggers your constellation effects is also quite relevant. Moving on to the black commons, black has some quite powerful ones, starting with Mire's Grasp, which is my early pick for best common in the set. It just works so well with so many of the color combinations. It's a 2-mana removal spell in black, and oftentimes you're going to be able to recur it or get additional value from the fact that it is an enchantment. Next is Final Death, a very powerful removal spell, even though it is a bit expensive. The first copy of this is still going to be quite good. It does a good job of blowing out creatures that are enchanted, because it can kill creatures no matter how big they are, and it exiles them, so if they do have escape, it will kill them permanently. Next, the third best black common is Blight Breath Catoplebus. You can't play unlimited numbers of these, but they are quite powerful. 6 mana, 3/2 that can give a creature -2/2 on its surface is not great, but when you start factoring in the fact that the creature can be given -2/2 like at the base level, and then go all the way up to like really any number, so -5 kills basically anything in the set, and does not seem that unreasonable to me. Moving on to the red commons, as the top red common I have Iroas's Blessing. It is very difficult to pick your moment with the spell, but when you do, you get a pretty powerful removal spell, dealing 4 to any creature and ending up with a slightly bigger creature as well. The fact that it is an aura can also be beneficial for a variety of cards in the set, and it will enable you to trigger your pseudo-heroic cards like the white common that I highlighted earlier. I think it's overall going to be the best red common, followed by Omen of the Forge. 2 damage doesn't kill everything in the set, but it also is an enchantment to trigger your cards that care about that, and 2 damage can help finish off other creatures that maybe took some damage in combat, and there are certain cards that let you sacrifice enchantments for other ways of getting value, so I think Omen of the Forge is going to be pretty good as well. And then finally, I have Incendiary Oracle as the third best red common. I think this card's going to be pretty effective. It is a 2-drop that has relative uses in the late game, and the exile clause is actually somewhat relevant in this set, both because you can exile escape cards and exile cards that would potentially fuel escape. Finally, we move on to the green commons. As the best green common, I have Warbriar Blessing. You really can't have too many of these, as long as you have a reasonably sized creature, a 3/3 or a 4/4, which is not that hard to do, or even a 4/3. Anything with 4 power is going to be pretty good with Warbriar Blessing, and you're going to be able to use this. They work pretty well in multiples, and it is an aura, which gives you additional benefits in this set. The second best green common I have as Voracious Typhon. I think this card is going to be quite good. It is the first card on this list with Escape, so I'm going to take this moment to read what Escape does, because I realized I didn't explain that earlier, so sorry for that. But Escape essentially says exile 4 other cards from your graveyard. It's a different number for each escape card. You can exit. Some of them are escape 3, escape 2. There are even some rares that are escape 5. But basically, you exile some cards in addition to paying the escape cost, and then you cast that card from your graveyard. So Voracious Typhon is quite powerful because it's a 4-mana 4/4 on its front face, and then if it goes to the graveyard, you can eventually bring it back as a 7-mana 7/7, and you can escape unlimited times per game as long as your graveyard is full enough. So Voracious Typhon is definitely a threat. And then our third best green common is Elysian Caryatid. This card is very potent as well. 2-mana acceleration, fixes your colors, and can even tap for 2 mana in certain situations. It works pretty well with Voracious Typhon, lets you cast the escape part of that even earlier than you would normally, or lets you cast the 4/4 version, the 4/4 part of it on turn 3, which is quite potent. Moving on to the color rankings, I have the commons in the colors in the following order: black as the best, followed by green. I think those two are quite close, followed by red. There's a decent gap between green and red, and then white is relatively close to red, and then blue is relatively close to white. I think that none of the colors are unplayable. This is obviously my first impression, so don't really bias your picks based on these, but I do think black and green look like they have the best commons and uncommons. There's just a lot of very solid cards in there. Red and white are definitely rock solid. Blue's a little bit behind because some of the cards are relatively niche, but I do think blue is going to play out better than it looks based up because it operates at instant speed, which makes things difficult for your opponent. Moving on to the archetypes, my current guess for the best archetypes. This is based on analysis, but I obviously do not have a ton of experience with the cards at this point. My pick for best archetypes in the format, the top tier, green-black Escape, which essentially uses your graveyard as a resource. You can get some just nice value engines. Black and green have a lot of good removal. Black-red is a Sacrifice archetype. I think that's also going to be quite good. It seems to be well supported. There is a common in the set that lets you steal your opponent's creatures, so that will be a pretty nice payoff because nobody else really wants that. So you're going to be able to wheel that card and steal your opponent's creatures, sacrifice them. Also, there's just some nice little fodder makers as well, so I think that deck is going to be quite good as well. Red-white aggro/tokens is also going to be quite good, I think. There is several of the cards that have the pseudo-heroic ability that gives them +1/+0 when they are targeted with a spell, so I think that that is going to be a nice little way to buff your little tokens up and swing in for lethal. And then blue-green I think is going to be a top tier archetype. Green has a ton of fixing, so blue-green could potentially be a nice little splash archetype, but there's also just a ton of really powerful constellation payoffs, and there are a ton of enchantments in the set, so I'm pretty optimistic for blue-green. Moving on to the mid-tier is red-green. That's an archetype that cares about having 4-powered creatures in play. There's a couple of payoffs for that. It's also just a pretty solid aggressive deck with pretty large creatures, so I think the deck is going to be very solid. Next is blue-red cast cards on your opponent's turn. I think this deck has enough support to be good if you're probably the only drafter drafting it. It doesn't look like it can support multiple drafters very well, but if you get a couple of the payoffs, it definitely looks like it has some legs in the format. And then blue-black, I think this is mostly going to function as a control deck. Black has some good removal, blue has some nice counters, so you're going to be trying to play a slow controlling game, and I think it has the tools to do that, though you're going to want to make sure you do have ways to win in the late game against the other value decks in the format, because blue-green and black-green both look like they have really good tools for grinding in this format. At the low tier, these decks are by no means unplayable. I think these decks are definitely going to still be solid, but I'm a little bit less excited to draft them. Black-white auras doesn't seem like it has as clear of an identity. The black cards definitely are potent, but they don't necessarily mesh as well with the white cards because the white cards are pretty aggressive. So when you take a color that's mostly controlling and put it with a color that's mostly aggressive, it doesn't always lead to the best results, but I do think that the deck still can have potential just based on individual card quality. White-green is kind of an auras-based deck. There's some cards that care about having auras, and there's some cards that help you get auras. There's also some aura-based removal in those colors, but it just doesn't really have as clear of an identity as the other cards, so it's harder to judge whether or not the individual power level and just being an aggressive deck, which I think white-green is going to end up being. Just being an aggressive deck might be good enough, but I'm not sure at this point, and it's hard to judge how powerful the synergies are in those colors. And then finally, blue-white looks to be maybe a Skies deck, a deck that cares about having flyers in play, but I'm not sure if there's enough support for that kind of archetype. The common flyers don't seem insane to me, other than the white common, which was among the top white commons, and I don't see the incentive necessarily to play blue-white. A lot of blues cards will care about operating at instant speed. A lot of white cards want to be used aggressively, so I think blue-white is the deck that I'm least excited to draft, but obviously this is still early, and so don't discount any of these archetypes. Still definitely test them out, but this is just my initial impressions, and I think that I'm relatively confident that most of these decks are going to be in this area of the tier list. Next up are combat tricks to be aware of at your pre-release. We're just going to go through them. These are all of the common and uncommon combat tricks that you need to be afraid of and you need to potentially play around. I'm not including removal spells, but obviously if your opponent has a removal spell, that can blow you out in combat as well if you are going for a double block. But just going through the list, Indomitable Will. If your opponent is making a attack and you can offer the trade between 3/3s or something like that, and they're just only have 2 white mana up, throw an extra creature on there to block it and potentially prevent Indomitable from wrecking you. One of the other cards that you need to keep in mind, though, is Karametra's Blessing. This card, giving hexproof and indestructible to an enchanted creature or enchantment creature, is super potent, is really going to be key for the aggressive white decks in fending off the removal spells of the more controlling decks, especially if they are relying on one suited up creature. So Karametra's Blessing, I think, is going to be very scary for the controlling decks because giving their creature, creature hexproof is terrifying. So I think Karametra's Blessing and Indomitable will make white decks a little bit harder to play around. The third white combat trick on this list is Phalanx Tactics, and this one is very potent as well. The way it ends up working out is you can target one of your pseudo-heroic creatures, which you'll probably be able to get some of, and then that will give all of your creatures an additional +1/+0, including the creature you target. So it essentially will give all of your team +2/+1 and the creature you target +3/+1. So it's like a 2 mana inspired charge in some situations, which is terrifying. It isn't uncommon, so you won't play against it as much, but if your opponent makes an all-out attack, definitely keep this card in mind, especially if they have a heroic creature. Next up is Chain to Memory. We're in the blue cards. Chain to Memory, give a creature -4/-0 and scry 2. If you are going to be attacking and they have the tools to make a double block and a blue mana up, you need to keep this card in mind. I'm not saying you should never attack, because this card is probably going to be played a little bit less than other cards on this list, but it is definitely a trick to keep in mind. Next is Starlit Mantle. This card strikes me as quite good. It's essentially a 2-mana counterspell for removal, or you can sometimes use it to win combat in a pinch. I think that holding it up as like a counterspell for removal that targets your enchanted creature or your really important flyer or something like that is going to be really nice for blue decks, especially because they care about casting spells on the opponent's turn. It's going to be even more potent against decks that don't have access to instant speed removal, so you'll be able to hold this up along with other instants and then really get value out of using stuff on your opponent's turn. Next up is Stern Dismissal. We already mentioned this, but in combat this card can be an absolute nightmare, so keep that in mind. If you are going to go for a double block, try to play around Stern Dismissal when you can. Next up is Threnody Singer. This card isn't uncommon, but it definitely looks like it has the tools to really get someone. It's kind of like a Chain to Memory attached to a body, giving a creature potentially -3/-0 pretty easily, and also chipping in on the multi-block. So Threnody Singer, definitely something to keep in mind. Next is Aspect of Manticore. I think this card is pretty scary on the first turn it's cast, but after that it doesn't leave a permanent first strike like some similar effects have in the past, which means that after they get the value out of this, which they might be able to they'll probably be able to kill the creatures blocking it that turn, you'll be most likely able to trade against it later on. So if you are afraid of Aspect of Manticore, just try finding a creature that can single block, because then Aspect of Manticore will trade with that creature, and then the following turn you can try to do another single block. Infuriate is the next card on the list. +3/+2 is a lot of stats, but it doesn't stick around, and it doesn't really trigger the Enchantment Matters cards. That being said, it will still trigger the pseudo-heroic cards, and still is a lot of power and toughness. One of the cool things for playing around the red combat tricks is that Aspect of Manticore and Infuriate both kind of incentivize you to not go too big on your block in the current turn, rather just make a single block and then wait for the next turn to make a nice little multi-block, because if they use Infuriate, the creature doesn't get harder to block again in the future turns the way it would for an Indomitable Will or something like that sticks around and really leaves a threat on the field. So I think that those cards definitely get better, especially Aspect of Manticore. The bigger the creature you're targeting with it is, the scarier it's going to be. So if they have a 5/5 attacking you or something like that, be really wary of Aspect of Manticore if you're going to go for a triple block or something like that, because it'll really blow you out and make things difficult, because finding the forces to block a 5/5 a second time can be difficult. And then the final combat trick is Gift of Strength. This is not a super powerful combat trick, so I don't expect to see it all that often, but +3/+3 is definitely something to keep in mind, and it is really the only thing green can do at instant speed in this set, so keep that in mind when playing around green. This is really the only combat trick they have access to. Also, you may notice there are no black cards on this list. That's because black does not have a combat trick in this set. That's actually pretty big. If they're holding up a single black mana, you don't really need to be afraid. The closest black comes to a combat trick is removal spells, because they might be able to cast removal at instant speed to mess with combat, or there's a black card that lets you return a creature from the graveyard to play, but that's not like it has flash. but that's not really the same thing as a combat trick, so that's a good thing to know. Green only has one combat trick, so not really a ton to play around. Black doesn't have any combat tricks, and then blue has a ton of different things to do with instant speed. White has a pretty large range, and then red has a couple as well, so those are just combat tricks to keep in mind. Finally, we're going to go over a couple of trap cards and a couple of combos, so we'll start with the traps. First off, Unknown Shores. This card is just basically unplayable. I would really never play this card, even if you're trying to splash, because the thing is if you're using it to make your splash color, you have to spend an extra mana to cast the spell. So maybe the 4 mana removal spell you're trying to cast isn't as good when you're casting for 5 mana and wouldn't even be worth a splash. And if you ever have to use Unknown Shores to cast spells in your main color, tacking on that extra mana just is not great. Instead of playing Unknown Shores, try to find something like a Traveler's Amulet. There's a 3 mana artifact in that taps for a mana of any color. And then you can also just play an extra basic land of the splash color that you're trying to splash, because the times that you do draw that basic land, you'll be able to cast your splash card. And when you're trying to cast spells on color, you'll be paying an extra mana anyway, because the basic land won't be tapping for those colors. So it's basically an Unknown Shores in those situations as well, as long as you draw the correct land as your next land. Yeah, I would just do not play Unknown Shores. It's just never going to be worth it. Next up is Birth of Meletis. I think this card is going to be a trap because people like to draw comparisons with it to Wall of Omens. However, a lot of the time, white decks are not going to be interested in a 0/4 for 2 mana. It's just not really worth a card to them because the white decks are relatively assertive in this format, it seems to me. They're relatively aggressive, and so 2 mana 0/4 that maybe like helps them smooth their draws a little bit doesn't really do much. And even in the controlling decks, it's just not a super powerful card. So I'd avoid Birth of Meletis if possible. Next is Sage of Mysteries. People love mill cards. People are also terrified of mill cards, and so if you ever see your opponent play this against you, you might get a little bit scared, but do not fear. This card is not great. 1 mana 0/2 that's not an enchantment to trigger things, and really isn't going to get a ton of value. It only mills 2 cards each time. Really, this card is just not going to be worth it. Honestly, the most terrifying thing they could probably do with it is mill themselves, because that might mean that they have some really scary escape cards to try and fuel. Next up is Triumph of Anax. This card is really just too slow, doesn't really do much. For 3 mana, you want to be affecting the board more directly, rather than just giving creatures slowly increasing power, because the thing is it doesn't even increase the toughness of the creature. It only gives the creature like +X+0, so the creatures are still going to trade in combat. So if you have a 2/2, it's still going to trade for their 2/2, even if you've given it +1/+0 and trample. And 3 mana to push through a couple extra points of damage is not worth it. Even if you think the fight part of it is going to give you a little bit of value, that's generally not going to be the case, because your opponent can plan around it incredibly effectively. They can wait until you have that and then kill the biggest creature you have in response to the 3rd trigger. They can even wait for you to target the creatures to fight each other and then pump their creature with a pump spell. Because once you target it, you can't back down, because it's not a may fight. They just do fight once you've chosen the targets. Moving on to some cool combos. There is a nice combo. These are combos that you can find at common, so keep that in mind. Dreadful Apathy plus Flicker of Fate is a monocolored combo. One of the things you can do is you can use the second ability on Dreadful Apathy to exile the creature that is enchanting, and in response to that trigger, use Flicker of Fate to exile your Dreadful Apathy and return it to the battlefield attached to something else. The exile enchanted creature will still go on the stack and exile the creature that Dreadful Apathy was attached to, and then it will essentially let you use Flicker of Fate as another copy of Dreadful Apathy for 5 mana. So that is a pretty nice combo to be aware of. So if you have a Dreadful Apathy, prioritizing a 1 Flicker of Fate putting 1 copy of Flicker of Fate in your deck is a little bit of a better move. Flicker of Fate is already a card you can be pretty confident to get value out of at least once, so playing 1 copy is pretty solid in most white decks, but it's even more solid in decks with Dreadful Apathy. I still probably wouldn't play more than 1 though. And then another combo is Rapid in Flames plus Hero of the Games, though I use that mostly to demonstrate a combo solely within red. Rapid in Flames also combos with any of the other pseudo-heroic creatures like the white common we mentioned earlier, but essentially with Rapid in Flames you can target your own pseudo-heroic creatures with that to trigger their ability. So you can deal maybe 1 damage to 1 damage each to 2 of your opponent's creatures, and then 1 damage to your own Hero of the Games to pump your entire team. So keep that in mind with Rapid Flames. I think it's actually going to be a card that most aggressive red decks want pretty much exactly 1 copy of. It's not really great in multiples, but I think 1 copy is going to be great in the red decks. Finally, some final tips. Play some enchantment removal in the main deck. This is just a general tip, but because this is a Theros set, there are tons of enchantments in the set. You're going to be able to get value out of your enchantment removal, so I would be fairly confident main decking 2 pieces of enchantment removal in the main deck, and I think that's going to be a pretty good tip. And then finally, don't play scared against the blue decks. One of the things that blue decks can do in this format, it seems, is hold up all of their mana for your turn and then cast flash spells or counter spells on your turn, or removal spells even, And if you play scared against blue decks, you're going to get way more punished by them when they just don't have anything. They wait till your turn, and then you you don't cast any spells because you're afraid, and they just tap out for their card draw or their flash creature. If you play maybe into the counter spells, you can get them out of their opponent's hand, or if they don't have the counter spell, then you can keep developing your board. One big exception to this is if you have your own types of flash spells, in which case you can wait till your opponent taps out to play them, or you can, if you're far enough ahead on board, sometimes you don't care if they just cast a card draw spell, but a lot of the time playing scared against the blue decks is going to give them the time they need, because I think blue might be the weakest color, but it has a play pattern that makes it kind of terrifying to play against. So don't play scared against the blue decks and you will do better in this format. That is going to do it for this complete limited guide for Theros Beyond Death. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Remember to help me out by clicking that like button, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment if you have any questions or feedback. And in the comment section down below, leave a hashtag #BeyondReady, because you are ready for your first draft, you're ready for your pre-release, and I hope you crush the set. As always, I do hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have any feedback, and I will talk to you in my next video.